Welcome to the Forest of Thoughts with me, Ingrid Rieser. We've reached the 5th and final episode of our On the Road season. Thank you to everyone who has followed along. In today's episode, we'll be looking into the deep past to see what we can learn that may help us on the challenging path ahead. So, how are our modern ways of thinking and being different from those of ancient peoples? When did logic and rational thinking become common sense instead of just one of the many ways we may contemplate life's important questions? And how is our consciousness and presence in the world altered as we become ever more enmeshed in advanced technologies? Our guide for this episode is philosopher Jeremy Naydler.
I think all of nature is crying out for human beings to attend, to give their attention, because that is a form of nourishment, and we all know that. If you have kids, the one thing they want is to have your attention. That does something for them, and it's the same with nature. Everything in nature wants you to look, to stop, look, wonder. And those are the things which the technological attitude will undermine, I think, over and over again.
Jeremy is a gardener and a philosopher based in Oxford, England. He's written several books on the experience of the sacred in ancient cultures. In his newer work, he focuses on the fraught relationship between humans and technology as it has developed from ancient times until today. And he explores how the acceleration of modern technologies forces us to examine how we cultivate the human in an era of machines. My partner Isak and I visited Jeremy at his house on the outskirts of Oxford. He and his partner Luann showed us around their garden, which was a joyous patchwork of trees, flowers, vegetables, and also 2 wild beehives, where the honey was left for the bees to enjoy themselves. We sat around a table in the winter garden with Pablo the cat popping in to join us.
He's a real lap cat, so be prepared for being jumped on.
That's fine. Would it be alright for people to hear a bit about your background and kind of, because you're a philosopher and a gardener, and maybe could you start by saying something about how it was that you came to be focused on those 2 things?
No, from a young age, I was interested in philosophy. I was interested in the whole question of the meaning of life, which is something which unfortunately academic philosophy wasn't particularly concerned with. So I did manage to get up to Oxford, and I studied philosophy there for a little while, and I was so put off by having to read Oxford philosophers who were linguistic philosophers. And they were interested in language and the contortions of language, and they weren't interested in the meaning of life at all. So I was I was sort of defeated by that, and I was not ready for it either. I stomped out of Oxford and went for a very long walk to Wales, actually, where you've just been. So. And that was actually a wonderful experience. It's the first time I really said no to anything. And in some no's, you're actually saying yes to something else. And that was how it felt. So I said yes to becoming a hobo for many months. And then eventually, after several years, I found my way back to university, because that question of the meaning of life continued to bug me, and philosophy just drew me to it. So I went to university again in York, where it was a very different scene, much more open. So I got really good tuition in York, and I was also able to pursue things which I was actually interested in outside the curriculum, and that was wonderful for me. So I was able to write about Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle and Jean-Paul Sartre and the imagination. I was interested in the imagination. I'm not sure about Sartre's view of the imagination, but anyway, it was the imagination that really drew me. After that, when I was there, I got into gardening, and I realized that actually that was a way of living that if I lived frugally, then I could actually earn my living gardening in the afternoons and doing scholarly stuff in the mornings. Although the gardening itself, there's another story to that, because I actually was working in archaeology at that point. In York, it was actually an old cemetery that we were working on, and you had to scrape around these bones and brush them very carefully with a sort of paintbrush to make sure you didn't damage them. I realized that wasn't the relationship to the earth that I really wanted. Growing things, sowing seeds and watching them grow was much more to my liking. Yeah, and there was also a very important balance for me to be not just in relation to the earth, but in relation to growing things, actually living nature. That was the thing that I needed as a counterbalance to the work with the books and the ideas.
If you started with the question, what is the meaning of life?
Oh, yes, I haven't told you what the meaning of life is yet.
Yes, exactly. I was just waiting for that. No.
Yeah, it's a secret, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I can't divulge that.
It's certainly surprising that wasn't, the center of a central topic in a philosophy department. I would say, but
unmentionable.
Unmentionable. Yeah, it's surprising. So where do you feel that your sort of paths of inquiry? I guess that's. I mean, it's. I think it's a starting point for a lot of us who are sort of wondering, well, what is this place where we find ourselves here on Earth, and what is it that we're meant to be doing, and so on.
Exactly. It comes back actually to the question of, well, what does it really mean to be a human being? That's why I loved Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas as well. It's part of the Western wisdom tradition. It's to be fully human, you have to come to a relationship with that which is spiritual within the human being. And Aristotle was very clear about that one can actually reach an experience of it in the activity of thinking. Not the discursive logical thinking, which his name is associated with most, I suppose, but with more contemplative thinking. And he called it the thinking of thinking. And if you think what the thinking of thinking is, it's actually going beyond thinking. You're not thinking about anything. You're actually, whatever it is that you're thinking about is not actually the focus. The focus is on the activity itself. In other words, it's a contemplative activity. You go into a deep meditative state, and there you come through to a relationship to something that's beyond the human, it's divine. So that was the thing that inspired me in Aristotle. And of course that then is absorbed into the Western tradition, and so not just Aquinas but Boethius, and there's a whole lot of thinkers right up to the Renaissance who are seeing that philosophy is a contemplative path, and very important for the whole monastic tradition.
Could you say something more about, because I think that one of the things that you sort of talk about is how we think that thinking is just one sort of activity, but actually there are many, like you just said, there's sort of many different ways of thinking. and that some modes of thinking are best suited to certain tasks. But now we've got into a situation where we think that logic and rationality is sort of the only way to think about the questions that are most important, and that drifting into anything else is not sort of a valid source of knowing. Mm-hmm. And I think what's really fascinating in your work as well is you talk about how ancient peoples and also like the ancient Greeks and the first those philosophers were much more aware of that there are different ways to think and that you can use them sort of to different purposes. But could you say something more about that?
Yeah, well, there's instrumental thinking where you're thinking to some end. So you have a problem, you need to solve it. So you have to think, what steps do I take in order to solve this problem? That's one sort of thinking, and for that you have to be very logical. And that's the sort of thinking that goes into the construction of machines. It's sort of machine thinking in a way, which logic is the foundation of. You can't build a machine if you're not thinking logically. But then there's the thinking which is an end in itself, thinking for its own sake, and then you're in a different arena completely. So it's not to solve a problem, it's to perhaps gain an insight or an intuition into the nature of reality. Then it's completely useless, you see. You're not going to get anything out of it except an insight. So what's the point of that?
How do you know if you're doing it right?
Because the logic comes to your aid. It's not that you're not using logic. Logic is always there to act as a corrective, I would say. If it doesn't stack up logically, then you know your insight has not been quite as good as you thought it was.
Right, so it's about reaching a certain insight through contemplation. Mm-hmm. And then seeing, well, if I do look at this now logically, does it also hold up to that? Is it a kind of combination?
I think so, yes. I think that's how it needs to work. So both levels of thinking. But the use of the logic has to be free of presuppositions. And so much of our logical thinking today is based on materialistic presuppositions, which would automatically discount the value of contemplative insight.
So that, for example, that the physical realm is sort of the only real realm, and
the only reality, of course.
The only reality.
Yeah. But in contemplative thinking, you actually come to experience that there is another reality, there's another dimension of reality. Yeah.
Do you want to say something more about that? Because I think it's one of the things. It's one of the things where, trying to really articulate, well, what is the difference between a machine and a human, and what reason would there be that humans are not just biological machines? Then it's the fact that a machine doesn't have an inner realm or an imagination. But I think that a lot of people doubt the truth and reality of their inner life.
Yeah. The way I experience it is that it's actually like entering into a dialogue. And where do the insights actually come from? Right. That's always the question. And I can only speak from my experience that I receive them. The act of contemplation is actually an active receptivity, to to what will open up for you if you open yourself up in that direction. So you have a particular question or subject that you're meditating on, and you hold that subject in your mind, and then insights will begin to unfold. So it always feels to me like a dialogue. Almost it's a dialogue across the threshold of one's own unknowing. You come up to that threshold where you really don't know yourself, but then insights come. It's a kind of an edge of knowledge, which you, as an individual, as an identifiable individual, actually can't go beyond. But then there's something else in you which is able to step across that threshold. It often feels like there's a sort of knot there, which one comes up against, and it's very difficult to undo that knot. And then by repeatedly coming back to it, something is undone, and then you're in a different place. Yeah.
It's interesting then to think about how does one work with the interplay between the inward contemplation and then looking outward to see, well, what have others said of this, or like how have people thought about this in other places in other times, which I mean some of your writing is about, the ancient cultures like ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, but also more recent. And I guess that also enters into it as a dialogue as well, that it can inform, but then that perhaps needs to be brought into that contemplation as well.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And I said that logic can act as a sort of corrective, but it's also what other people have said that's also a corrective to your thinking. And one has to have people, other writers, other thinkers, contemplatives who one respects, who one can refer to, who can then help to guide you. You have to have your guides. Very important. So I have my what are they? The sort of spiritual helpers who are kind of there to refer to.
Well, because one of the things that struck me when I was reading some of your work is how you really managed to also emphasize that our ways of thinking about the world and our ways of being in the world have been fundamentally different, and that if you look at at ancient cultures, their way of trying to understand the world, if we take it seriously and not as some sort of that they were superstitious and not smart enough to understand the way the world really is, but actually with an openness that says, well, maybe they're onto something that we've forgotten. And a friend of mine was also saying this, that it's that you point to some of that forgetting that we seem to have been taking part in, and we have sort of, that there is a lot that we can gather from approaching and really trying to imagine and live into the ways of thinking and being that people a long time ago took for granted.
It's an amazing thing that we actually have that capacity to do that, to enter into the inner life of other people, whether they're our contemporaries, but also in the distant past. You can actually, we have that capacity to enter into the inner world of people who are living thousands of years ago. I mean, sometimes it's quite challenging, and of course you don't know if you really got it right, but but when there's very rich textual evidence there, and also rich imagery, as in ancient Egypt, it's really the historians vocation to use that as the way in. It can give you a leverage on the mentality that produced those artifacts and those writings.
Could you give sort of an example of, so people maybe understand a bit of how some of the peoples that you have studied had a different way of approaching the world than we do?
Yeah, one example would be in ancient Egypt you have texts which were highly illustrated, like the Book of the Dead, which is the most famous one. But there are lots of other ancient Egyptian religious texts which are less well known. But in that one you have these texts which are mainly, I suppose we call them prayers, and accompanied by illustrations. And the illustrations themselves, for example, might show a human being in a relationship to a god or a goddess. And then the text will be perhaps recording words that are said to that god or goddess. So there you're presented with a world that's very, very different from our own. We don't really deal much in gods and goddesses, most of us. But it's very real for them, and so real that they can actually illustrate it. For example, the goddess Nut is the sky goddess who appears in a tree, and the scribe Ani, who's one of the Book of the Dead subjects, so he had a whole so-called Book of the Dead made for him.
So he would find his way.
He's there in front of this tree, addressing the goddess in the tree, and that's immediately. So what's the goddess doing in the tree? You have to really work out what's going on and what world they're in. It's a world in which actually trees can be inhabited by goddesses, by spiritual beings, and the whole of ancient Egyptian spirituality has this very concrete characteristic of the gods and goddesses being there, being almost like companions of the living. They're so present to the ancient Egyptians that you feel that their world was saturated with divine beings. So there you've got a relationship on the one hand to nature, where nature is infused with spirit, and then on the other hand you have human beings themselves in relationship to a divine world. They have a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses that have all different functions and will be invoked in different circumstances. I got into ancient Egypt because I really wanted to understand what state of consciousness people were in before philosophy, because I was so enamored with philosophy. But I realized, of course, philosophy has a starting point, more or less 7th century BC, and so what happened before that? Where were people at before then? What sort of consciousness did they have? Because philosophy brought in this consciousness which was increasingly based on the sort of independence of the spiritual world that previously was almost overwhelmingly present to previous cultures.
So that thinking, the philosophical thinking was sort of freeing itself from...
Philosophical thinking was a way in which people freed themselves. Yeah. So
from the world of the gods and the world of the spiritual.
From the world of the gods. And one can see there are lots of dramatic episodes in early Greek history where that's made very apparent, that the philosophers were in direct opposition to the priests and were challenging them, really saying they're figments of your imagination, basically, that whole world of gods and goddesses. And we have to stand on our own feet. And part of that new consciousness was also a consciousness in which nature necessarily became despiritualized. So the Greeks inaugurated the modern consciousness, where you have this prioritization of thinking, logical thinking, because the logic which was formulated by Aristotle then became more and more kind of part of the way everyone thought. It became, over the centuries, it became sort of second nature, really, that, like, we call it common sense, but that's actually logic. And that gave people an independence complete independence from the world of the gods. But at the same time, nature becomes depersonalized, because when you're standing in front of a tree and you're actually addressing a goddess, you're actually addressing a you, rather than an it. And that's the shift that happens. Nature becomes increasingly an it rather than a you. The personal relationship goes. When you itify something, it's much more easy to mistreat it. And unfortunately, that is the precondition, really, for the scientific revolution, which would then eventually happen.
So, because it feels like the ancient people of Egypt, for example, like you've written about how they saw the world through, using myth, feeling, imagination, etc., more than logic, and that as philosophy is born, there is that sort of separation, and the humans are trying to free themselves more from the world of the gods. But was that necessary? Was there something good about that? Because now it feels like we take for most people sort of take for granted that the world of the gods is not a way that they relate to the world anyway, and that if there is something out there greater than us, then it probably doesn't care what we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. So it feels like we're in the situation, like you said, where nature is no longer seen as sacred, and the world of the gods is often not seen as a reality. But was it also necessary for humans to remove themselves in that way? To become independent in a way?
Yeah, of course you have to see what was gained by that. Yeah, and it was freedom. Our freedom was gained. Free to make our own decisions, make our choices. Because
before that, it was more about understanding what the gods wanted from you, and
you had to do what the gods wanted you to do, or else you're in deep trouble. Yeah. In order to gain that independence and freedom, we had to step away from that divine world, and take responsibility for our own actions. And that means, of course, becoming much more morally responsible. So there lies a big challenge for human beings, to become their own masters, as it were, and to make our own choices and to bear the responsibility of our actions, and to then also strive to find the meaning that we've lost, and to create. I think you have to create it, basically. It's no longer handed to you on a plate as it was then. You were born into a world of fraught with meaning in those days, because everything was meaningful. The smallest action was meaningful, and the smallest event. Whereas today we have the opposite problem of everything being potentially absolutely meaningless unless we contribute meaning to the world. It's not going to present meaning to us. And that's a really important gain, I think, that we actually have to stand on our own feet and relate ourselves to the spiritual world from out of our own efforts, because it's simply not there anymore for us unless we address it and change our attitude towards it. And something Rudolf Steiner said was that the stars no longer speak to us. It's up to us to speak to the stars. It's very beautifully put, I think.
As Jeremy said, his philosophical inquiry began with the question of what is the meaning of life? And entangled with that is another question, namely, what does it mean to be a human being?
One answer that Heidegger gives in is a very important essay that he wrote called The Question Concerning Technology. And there he says that the problem with technology is it actually takes us away from the human essence. And the human essence, he says, is that we are an openness to being with a capital B. In other words, what makes us human is our ability to stand in the world in a reverent awe at the mystery of existence. And technology really takes us in the opposite direction from that. So I would say then that a human being is someone who is able to live their lives with complete reverence for other people and for nature and for existence itself. This is, I suppose it's a sort of religious, you could say religious metaphysical definition of what it means to be human. Of course, there's a lot more to being human than that, but that's one thing. I suppose it's become important for me, especially in relation to the technological question, because that's what we're confronted with now, and it's such a powerful, I suppose, intrusion into our lives now, and really challenging us existentially. So how are human beings different from machines? But it's actually what Heidegger was really looking at was not so much exactly that question, how are human beings different from machines, but how does the technological attitude undermine the truly human attitude towards being in the world? And for him it's that awareness of and a sort of sensitivity to the sacredness of things that's absolutely definitive of what a human being can be or should be. When people who are much enamored of technology, and they say, well, it's actually technology that can solve our ecological problems. If only we accumulate sufficient data and we feed it into our computers, then they will present us with the answers that we're looking for. The thing is that then you're referring not to yourself anymore, and it's really a change of heart that's necessary, I think, where one is relating to that in us which is able to relate to the world reverentially. That's the key.
It's certainly something we don't that it doesn't seem like machines can do. Machines cannot revere, machines can't feel awe, it seems.
Yeah, in the contemplative tradition, it's the quality of our attentiveness that's the key thing. And if you have a question, like for example, you're in a situation where you're in nature and you want to find out the name of a plant or something, and you've got your smartphone and you can just do it because you've got the right app. You can just find that name, and then you can move on and you know the name of that plant. But in the contemplative tradition, that would be to actually take us away from a real relating to the plant. And if you were to simply spend just a few minutes attending to that plant, you would then form a relationship to the plant, and it wouldn't matter what its name was. And furthermore, you would actually be giving something to the plant. You would be giving your loving, or certainly your attentiveness, your wish to relate to it. That would be a gift that you'd be giving to the plant. And I think all of nature is crying out for human beings to attend, to give their attention, because that is a form of nourishment, and we all know that. When if you have kids, the one thing they want is to have your attention, and that does something for them. And it's the same with nature. Everything in nature wants you to look, to stop, look, wonder, and those are the things which the technological attitude will undermine, I think, over and over again. So we become more alienated, and we defer to the smartphone or the computer or whatever it is, and we feel that where the repository of our knowing is located is in that virtual domain rather than in our actual living relationship. And that's becoming more and more intensified now. Human beings are being lured into a regard for the technological world. I mean, I'm talking about computers, that world of incredible accumulated data and knowledge, and then also ability to simulate the real world. We're beginning to feel that is actually the only authentic place to really understand and relate to the natural world from. So we were talking earlier about the ecologists who feel that it's only the amassing of data that can solve our ecological problems. But that's to regard the whole wondrous sort of AI cleverness as the arbiter now of our knowing and relating. And that's really a very dangerous thing, I think, because as the metaverse actually gains in strength, and people feel, which I think it's almost bound to happen, that actually it'd be so much better than Zooming to actually go into a virtual domain and have a meeting in sort of metaverse environment, wearing your VR headset and all the rest. That would be, in a way, much more ecological way of relating to each other, because we wouldn't be consuming petrol or flying around. And wow, what does that mean for our relationship to the primal reality of nature? It is the aim of those companies and organisations like the WEF to make the experience that a human being can have in the metaverse actually a rival to the experience that we have in the natural world. So that's explicitly stated. They really want to shift the whole balance of human life into the digital world, away from the natural world. It's quite extraordinary, really. But there we are, and so we regard ourselves increasingly as digital citizens, and we have our computer-generated bodies that we inhabit in the virtual world, and we regard those computer-generated bodies as being as much ours as our actual physical body. I was going to give an example, actually, which I found really fascinating, where it was just, it must have been the beginning of last year, when Facebook, or a subsidiary of Facebook, produced a new app for those who are in the virtual world, where they could actually type something on their laptop or tablet or whatever it is when they're wearing their VR headset, and in the virtual world they could type on their actual laptop and send an actual email from the virtual world into the real world. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary thing to see that was a breakthrough, and that is going to be the paradigm now for the future, that you will be able to actually live your life in virtuality, earn real money from activities that you pursue there, and the primary reality of the natural world will become a secondary reality. So your primary reality, your loyalty will go towards the virtual. Then how can you relate to the natural world with reverence? You see, how can you stand in awe and wonder before a flower? Because you become adjusted so deeply to being surrounded by living in a computer-generated reality.
I think a really interesting thing about that is something that Isak and I have talked about, which is this trying to discern between the real thing, real reality, primary reality, and its counterfeit. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, like you say, the virtual, the counterfeit, so something that seems real but is not real. Of course, as the technology develops further, it gets so convincing, and our bodies respond to it. I mean, I've tried the same of, if you watch a TV program about nature, you get just some version of the calm and the joy you get from having been to a beautiful place. And there's a difference in quality. I think you also write in your book about what is the difference in quality between light that we see from the sun or from a fire or from a candle versus the light that is generated by electricity. And there's a real difference. There's a real qualitative difference, and we can feel it. It isn't as nice to have one of those battery-driven candles as it is to light a candle. They're just totally different categories, and that we sort of need to trust our intuitive feeling about that these two things actually aren't the same. But it's interesting that what's hard about the virtual world is that everything is so bright and so loud and so overwhelming that the more subtle and nuanced sort of listening and noticing that we need to really perhaps enter into that state of awe and reverence, it becomes harder and harder for us. It's like we're listening to music on very loud volume the whole time, and then trying to listen for a whisper. And so we become desensitized in a way. And I think that discernment is going to be very tricky for us, because at the same time we also feel that, well, having a Zoom call with a loved one is not the same as meeting them in person, but it's still that person, and it's still talking to them, right? But I think what's interesting is, well, what do we do with this? Because I think that maybe our initial response is, I'm just not going to spend time on technologies, and I need to get rid of my smartphone, and I need to, etc. But it also feels like that might not be, at least for us individually, to limit our time using these immersive technological devices may not be the most useful path. I don't know. What do you think about that? How do we respond to this?
Where do you draw the line? Well, Nokia just recently announced that their ambition is to, within the next 10 years, have the smartphone in your body. So to actually place the smartphone in your body, or the equivalent of a smartphone. where do you draw the line? And you might say, well, perhaps it's all right to have a smartphone, and that's okay, and then maybe it's all right then to have smart glasses that you put on, so you can then have an AR application, but then to actually integrate it in your own body, where do you draw the line? I actually don't have a smartphone and I don't want one, but I think that it's quite possible to have a smartphone, and so long as you have the right relationship with it and you're not addicted to it, you're able to turn it off, and you're able to have conversations with people where you don't keep getting it out and looking things up or answering calls or whatever it is. Fine. But it's a question of our freedom again. We have to keep asking ourselves, how do I stand in relationship to this technology? Am I really free or not? Is it enhancing my freedom, or is it actually detracting from it? And I think the addictive problem is so huge. And I see it myself just, with my tabletop computer. It has an addictive tendency, the emails coming in. You get interested in who's writing to you and all of that. But so one has to really keep questioning oneself and being quite firm with oneself in order to uphold one's independence in relation to the technology and not become a slave to it. I think that would be extremely difficult once it becomes integrated in the body and you have the brain-computer interface, which is what's being developed. I mean, it's already been developed to a certain extent now. But a brain-computer interface, I think, would be hugely detrimental to people.
Apart from sort of trying to limit the sort of negative impacts and the addictive tendencies, what are some things to cultivate within ourselves that help us with our human rather than our machine-like capacities?
Yes, no, it's something that I think about much. Well, number one is to go for walks in nature. Yeah. I think the cultivation of wonder is very important. Each day I try, when I'm gardening, I try to go out and not just be doing all the stuff I have to do, but to actually stop in front of something and feel wonder towards it. I feel that's the kind of inner discipline that is actually incredibly nourishing for oneself. Just to do that, and you can, at the end of the day, you can say, yeah, that plant that I looked at is just so amazing. It's just that experience of giving your attention to something for a few minutes. It only has to be a few minutes, but really to give complete selfless attention to something. The other thing which I think is really important is to be sensitive to one's own inner promptings in terms of conscience. I'm not sure if conscience would be the right word, but what you feel is the right thing to do in any circumstance, to actually be able to give yourself time to notice what it is that's actually wanting to make itself present to your consciousness, as it were. Yeah. Of course, it's so easy to not give that time to doing that, but it's, again, another discipline that we have to really actively cultivate. And then I think also there's a huge importance in cultivating friendships, which are not screen-based, but because friendships are based on love, really. And yeah, that's also something we can freely do. You can't be forced to be friends with someone. It's something that it's an expression of one's own free will. There are quite a lot of things, actually, when I come to think about it, that one can do. But you mentioned the different quality of light, and I think actually to attend to the changing qualities of sunlight it's another very strong but subtle thing that one can spend time doing. You find that actually these different qualities, which speak in a different way, the way something is illumined, can bring out a quite different mood in that thing, or if it's, say, the light in a wood. I remember I felt that very strongly some years ago in France when I was going down a path in the wood on a sunny day. And when I got to the end of the path, I turned around and walked back the other way, and I was amazed that the sun was shining on the leaves in a completely different way. What seemed actually quite a sort of dull path going one way became absolutely magical the other way, because the light was shining through the leaves. And that's an extraordinary thing, this sort of backlit illumination, which is why our smartphones are so alluring for us, because it's all backlit. But in nature, that backlighting is something, there's something mystical about it, actually. There's a mystery connected with the light which we really need to tune into, because light has always been both outer and inner. You know, when you have an illuminating thought, you're experiencing light as an inner force within you, and that was acknowledged right up until the 1860s. And then when James Clerk Maxwell redefined light as a disturbance in the electromagnetic field, we lost the symbolic reality of light and the sacred reality of light. And that opened the way for the influx of electronic technologies. And that meant that it just became metaphorical to speak of someone being enlightened, or, you know, even having an insight into something, because you can only have insight if there's light. So it assumes there's an inner light.
Interesting that it's a dual movement of light losing its significance, and then, as you write about in your book, In the Shadow of the Machine, that electricity going from being something that was only experienced through lightning and thunder and something that was generally associated with the gods of the underworld, and something quite dramatic and chaotic, became, instead of being this grand sort of overwhelming spiritual force, became very practical and became the essential, that, and as you write, that in combination with logic being these essential building blocks that made it possible to have this massive technological development that sort of culminated in computers. And so you have both electricity or lightning coming to pervade our lives so deeply in the form of electricity, and while light in that sense came to lose some of its significance somehow.
It's always seemed significant to me that in order to see your screen, the sunlight becomes very annoying.
Right.
You want to get rid of the sunlight.
They're in opposition.
They are.
What do you think the gods think of all of this AI and virtual technology?
They're waiting for us. Probably quite impatiently. But I think, of course, they also, as Jung said, they manifest in our complexes. And I think we're becoming more and more neurotic, actually, especially in relation to our devices. You can see there's a collective neurosis around them. Like when I travel up to London, and everyone on the train is fixated on their smartphones, and something that's not right. You can see it's not right. And I had the experience just recently where it was a crowded train, and the guy I was standing next to was looking at his smartphone, and he put it away. And then 1 minute later, it was out again. And it was like that all through the journey. He kept putting it away, and then, I must just look again. That's addiction, isn't it? It's like needing to have another fag. But this is somehow much more sinister for me. But yeah, I think there is a need to address this absence of the spiritual world by turning ourselves towards it, even if it's not immediately evident to us that it's there. Nevertheless, we still have to turn ourselves towards it, because unless we do that, it won't become apparent to us. I think, it's a well-populated world, the spiritual world.
I think that some of the things that you write about in your work is how we can look back and learn from older cultures, but not necessarily go back to their way of viewing things, but to go forward in a different way, which is kind of what you were talking about now too. But could you say something more about what is it that we maybe need to bring with us as we go into the future?
We can't go back. That's the thing. Much as some of us would love to go back, we can't because we've already gone beyond.
But would you like to go back to this world where it's more about just trying to follow the instructions from the gods?
No, I don't want to. I don't want to go back. Much as I feel a certain nostalgia for it, but it's simply not what we're here to do. We're here to go forward. And for me, that represents an enormous challenge, yes, to find our way forward. And we need to have, if you like, the archetype of the true human being there in our mind's eye to work towards. And for me, that's Christ. So Christianity, it's unfortunate that it's become so pallid. I don't know if pallid is quite the right word, but in institutionalized Christianity, it's lost its mystical core to a large extent. But I think that we can't do it on our own. Without, I mentioned Steiner again, he called Christ the representative of humanity. And I feel that's a good way of thinking of that being who represents our future. And unless we have that orientation towards what are the truly Christian values, and one could say faith, hope, and love are three of them, then we're going to be pretty lost. I mean, we're lost enough, even if we do have that image in our minds of what it is that we're supposed to become. But there is a whole task which in the Orthodox tradition is called theosis, or divinization. Dante called it the transhumanization, interestingly enough. And there you have it. You have on the one side the transhumanists, who would have us all become machines, cyborgs. But on the other hand, there's a genuinely spiritual inner transformation where we transhumanize and become, for Dante, it would be the spiritualization of a human being, so that we stand in the world as spiritually aligned and sort of morally and spiritually integrated and fully human. You can sometimes you meet people who have this quality. You say, there's a real human being. It's not that often.
So human being isn't something you just are automatically, it's something you become.
It's definitely something you become, but it's also something that you are in potential.
For me personally, I can connect quite well to the Judeo-Christian tradition, because I think that one of the things that I've been trying to do in my sort of searching is finding ways of finding what I'm looking for spiritually in my own context and culture, rather than needing to look somewhere else to some other foreign indigenous culture or Eastern culture. And I think that for me that has entailed some sorting and actually finding that, well, there actually are strands within the Judeo-Christian tradition that are the mystical strands that are about this deeper development and this deeper knowing, which is actually not about how Christianity or Judaism has been used as an excuse for, wars or exploitation or oppression. And so I just think for me that is also that it's really important just to emphasize that what I hear you talking about is something much deeper than how that has been expressed in the world.
Yeah. I think we're now living through an incredibly decadent phase of Christianity, and we need to breathe new life into it, new spiritual life into it. It has to become spiritually alive and within us. And the mystical tradition is where you go. The Philokalia, for example, which is this wonderful compilation of sayings and of the church fathers over the years. And there's real wise spiritual guidance there. How to live, how to deal with the sort of inner struggles that you go through. Just reading yesterday about answering back. It's a really good one. When you're assailed by negative thoughts, you answer them back with something positive. It's great. It's very practical, very down to earth in a way. That's the whole. There's a whole section of the book is on answering back. I think just sort of following on from that, I think it is incredibly valuable actually to know other spiritual traditions than the one that you sort of committed yourself to. It can be very enriching. This sort of cross-fertilization of different. Whether it's Buddhism or Taoism or whatever, you then see your own tradition in a different light. It sort of can become much more meaningful, because often one gets misled by the vocabulary that one's just got used to with one's own tradition, and then suddenly you can see so it's that they're talking about. You'd never really realised it until you read some Buddhist sutra or something.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for having us.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure, really. Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and hopefully Jeremy will be coming to Sweden for a live event in September 2023. So please follow Forest of Thought on social media or on Patreon to receive updates on that. You find links to the sources in the show notes and on the website forestofthought.com. If you enjoyed listening, please consider supporting the podcast at patreon.com/forestofthought or by sharing this episode with your family and friends. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll speak to you next time.